Welcome to another Confluence podcast. I'm Randall Stevens. I'm joined, as usual, with my co-host, Evan TRXL. And today's guest is Richard Harpham. Welcome, Richard.
Hey, nice to be here.
Yeah, I'll give the kind of brief background, and then you can fill in the gaps. But long time, Richard's been in the AEC industry for quite a while. He's primarily wearing his Revit shirt. He was early stages of the team at Revit prior to the Autodesk acquisition. And then I don't know the exact history, Richard, but whether you went over with the acquisition or was over at Autodesk before, but spent several years at Autodesk in kind of global product marketing roles in marketing this technology. So we're going to get to dive into part of that. And then spent a few years in the 10 years ago, or in the formation of the Katera platform.
Mm-hmm.
And then most recently is one of the co-founders of Skema. So we're gonna have a lot to talk about this afternoon. I was mentioning to Richard before we jumped on this podcast, I actually saw him across the room last weekend. We were both out in California for a Revit 25th year anniversary kind of party that a mutual friend of ours, Jim Balding, with the Ant Group, kind of pulled together. And there was probably 100 plus people in the room. Lots. It's kind of the who's who of the people around BIM over these last 25 years. So it was good to see you there, even though we didn't get to catch up. So we'll try to do some of that today.
I heard it was a
Okay,
huge
sounds
success,
great.
that get together.
Yeah, it was, Jim Bowling, he was one of the first, I would say, professional users of Revit, and he's been a kind of stalwart, passion Revit user for the last 25 years, I guess. Managed to pull together a group of people and managed to scam some people into giving a bit of money to put on a nice evening.
Nice.
So it was great fun, and lots of faces from the past. I think it's strange how sometimes a company, there's kind of little lightning in the bottle that happens that connects people in the ways that you'd never think they would. It would, and that's just one of those things that was surprising. It wasn't. I wouldn't say it was emotional. No, it was tearing up, but it was kind of fun to see some old faces.
I kind of made a comment to a couple of people that evening that we haven't had the Built conference in former RTC Built conference in a handful of years now, and I just said it was like half to 2/3 of the people that I would normally want to connect with or form those relationships over the years with at those conferences were there last weekend. So it was good to see everybody and to catch up. So
yeah.
Let's go back 25 years to that, joining the Revit team and getting that started. Maybe just talk about, this was all kind of new technology. We were going from, largely 2D CAD to this whole new concept of BIM. Maybe give some of your just thoughts and early experience on through into the Autodesk years about how do you market BIM? How did you teach the world what all this stuff was, and what are the challenges with that?
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about there. Like I said to you this before, please interrupt me and ask me to spend.
No, we'll dive in. We can make this. Yeah, we'll interrupt and ask questions along the way. It's fun.
I mean, I suppose how did I end up in Revit? Well, I started life as an architect and kind of really crossed the streams pretty early into the dark side and joined a construction company called Bovis. And they hired me out of architectural school, and my job when I joined was to help them figure out what this strange gray box was in the corner they had, which they'd spent a lot of money on. And it was actually a program called Acropolis, which was originally BDP Acropolis. It was something that was developed in the UK, and BDP Acropolis was this very, very programmable Unix 3D design solution. So I kind of like, my first taste of CAD was 3D CAD. And so I've always kind of been on that side. It kind of allowed me to be the brightest guy in the room for quite a long while. I think all of us who first got into CAD had that experience. You know, it was like,
I like that you called us the brightest guys.
yeah, I know. Whether we were bright or not, we just were the only ones who could actually figure out how to connect
It's a good spin.
to a pen as pen plotter. Do you remember pen plotters? And you know, figure out how to make that thing work. And so, you know, I had that history, which had led me to start up my own company. Because at that moment in time, if you knew anything about computers and design and CAD, you know, it meant that, you know, the internet and the World Wide Web had just started, and, you know, early 3D Studio Max, and, you know, you could almost like, you had this palette of things that you could do to build a business around. So I did that for about 3 or 4 years, and I got recruited by initially an Autodesk company to help them expand their dealership in the United Kingdom. And I did that as a part-time thing. But that led me to meet the Autodesk crowd. And I met the Autodesk crowd because I did the first websites for Autodesk in UK and Europe. And I would say, infamously, I met a guy there called Jeff Drust, and he said, you know, can you have this we need a website. Could you do it in 2 weeks? I said, absolutely. Never created a website before in my life. And sort of managed to get that done in
View
2
source,
weeks. And so that meant
copy paste.
Yeah. Yeah. That meant, you know, we were using, you know, I don't know, I can't remember what editor we were using. It was the early Microsoft one, but I had a graphic designer in tow, and we managed to beat the deadline working nonstop for 2 weeks. And that led me to do 2 or 3 others. So I got to know the Autodesk crowd. And when those guys got recruited into Revit, I think they remembered that I was someone who could get some stuff done, and I knew architecture. And they recruited me to be on the technical sales side, which is, for those of us in the industry, it's like demo jock, which at the time I was like, I don't want to go back to being a demo jock. I'm better than that now. But then I saw the product, and it was famously, it was a hotel called My Hotel in the center of London. And I met a guy called Axon Ehouse and James Dyer, James Dyer was ex-Autodesk, and they showed me this solution. And first thing that happened is it blue screened, and they rebooted. And then they said, well, I said, you know, I'd got familiar with architectural desktop, and I said, well, you know, what's the big differentiator? And they put a dimension between the wall and a door, and put a lock on it, and then moved the wall, and the door moved with it. And I was like, where do I sign?
Right.
You know, and that was how I got into Revit. You're right. I didn't join Autodesk directly from Revit Technologies. I actually put together the demonstration set that my now co-founder Marty used to demo to the Autodesk leadership when Revit got acquired. But I decided to leave about a month or so earlier and joined a company called Infosoft to help launch a product there, which wasn't so successful, but it went okay. But then Autodesk came back and recruited me initially to launch a product called Buzzsaw. I don't know if you remember that. And that was to launch it in the UK and Northern Europe. And we had a pretty successful year or two there. And then they just asked me, they were having problems with Revit in the United States and globally, trying to get market traction. And Dave Lamont and others from the original Revit team remembered me. And I met a guy called Phil Bernstein in a conference in Munich, and sat down for a cocktail, and I was ready to do something different. And I just said, hey, I think I can help you with Revit in the US. I think I can know how I can help you make that, you know, be more demonstrable for the market. And I guess 3 months later, I had me running all of marketing and sales development for all of the Americas, which was a huge jump up at the time for me. And that's what led me to kind of develop a really good partnership with Phil and getting this new concept called building information modeling into the market. And I'll stop for breath because I'm sure there's a few questions.
Did that, was the acronym that was in vogue at that time? I can't even remember when it.
Yeah. Well, there's a little bit of history there. So one of the last marketing efforts in Revit Technologies, Alex Niehaus and Rick Rendell, who was running marketing at the time, were trying to find, everyone in market. We can talk more about this as we talk about taking product to market. You're always trying to find your corner of the room, that you can talk and be seen to be the leader. So it's hard if you decide to at that time say, okay, we are the next best single building modeling solution, which was Graphisoft's kind of owned that at the time. So the initial proposal was this concept called concurrent building assets, CBAs, which everyone hated. I'm going to tell you, it's like we all just listened to Rick present it to us, and we were just like, "What on earth is that?" No, that's never going to fly. But CBAs was the precursor to building information modeling, and I think it was. I wasn't in the room when it happened, but there was a meeting up in New Hampshire where they came up with building information modeling as a concept. I think arguably people have suggested that the term had pre-existed, maybe as building information management, but it never really been marketed and no one really claimed it. And so when I came to the US and sat down with Phil, first thing we did is sit down and try and figure out a strategy for how we could, I would say, it was we call it, at the time it was called we called it thought leadership, which no one was really using that term very much, to create a program that was not run by the central marketing team, that was something that was very much more about, I would say, the professionals within Autodesk talking to the professionals in the industry, and particularly into the colleges and universities. So we started from, with a very, very different approach. I think Phil's kind of scholastic background, and maybe I had never worked in a corporation before, when really until I joined Autodesk. And I think my naivete around observing the corporate boundaries of what you could and couldn't do in the back of the room, coupled with Phil really not being interested in corporate at all, much more interested in almost being more of a lecturer than a marketer, led in those early few years to quite a different approach.
Did was part of the the earliest things I remember from Phil were the kind of infamous sawtooth drop off of information across. So I'm assuming that was one of your kind of central tenets to why this kind of new wave of technology was important and what problem it was going to solve.
Yeah, and it's funny. People have, and no one really knows the origin of that. I done a version of it to try and persuade, back in Revit days, to try and persuade us to actually almost like bundle up with AutoCAD LT at the time, because 2D editing in Revit was so bad. That was my assertion to the Revit leadership at the time, was like, look, if we can position ourselves as the best possible companion to AutoCAD LT, then we totally disrupt architectural desktop. And that didn't really get bought into that much, but I think that when we kind of looked at the sawtooth as a way of describing, moving from one product to the other, that was one of the big slides. We had, I think it was about a 15-slide deck that we used for the we used to call them Vision to Reality tour. We were on, and it was very carefully curated. It was like that was where the McClamey curve originated out of that process. Working with professionals in the industry, so there were a lot of sort of diagrams that have become very persistent that kind of came out of those 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, maybe we can put our hands on one, Evan, and put it up for everybody to see if they haven't.
What's funny is I'll put it up on here, but it literally came up on my other TRXL podcast like last week. That people are still talking about that sawtooth diagram.
Well, it's simple and it's easy to understand, and everybody's experienced it, right? This idea.
Yeah, we use it. We use it in Schema today, to try and explain the challenge.
There's always some loss, right? Lossy handoff of information. Yeah. So, when I was teaching part time, we were talking earlier before the podcast. Surprised one that we didn't cross paths back in that day, because my I had started a company called ArcVision back in the late 90s, and we had integrated early, I think the time when you were there, Richard, into Revit. I think it was in the 2001 timeframe, around uh, 3.0 or 3 dot something release of Revit. But anyway, so I was familiar with Revit, in the early stages, but I was teaching at the time just part-time at the College of Design at the University of Kentucky. And back in I'd started doing that in the 90s, and I was very similar to you. I was using like AutoCAD, but using it in 3D. I was always enamored with 3D and then 3D Studio. And when I was teaching those courses, I was started in the 90s with the AutoCAD and then using 3D Studio. And then we got into SketchUp, right? Which was, when you look at the history of where these things came about, it was like kind of Revit and SketchUp about the same time came on the scene.
Yeah.
And so I was just really eager with the students to find something easier to get them started, because it was like you had to have so much background in this stuff to even get started. And, when I started teaching Revit, though, I'm pretty sure in either 2003 or 2004. And what I wanted to ask, and I'm sure I didn't drive that being available at the university. I probably just saw it as part of the Autodesk initiative of products that were available. Is that true? When you talk about that you all were with Phil, with his, education background, was there a strategy to try to use the universities and students and get this out there like that?
Somewhat. I would say I would say we didn't really engage the student community as much as we engaged the professors.
Yeah.
So we tried to hold as many of the events as we could at, places like Penn State or other, colleges and universities where there were good populations of architectural folk. So I would say it was the students were often invited to come along to those events. But we were also trying to make them be a little bit exclusive, so, we did that. I think ultimately we did about 6, 7 or 8 of them. And obviously I say culminated because we didn't do so many afterwards, because we actually kind of got over the hump, which just led up to the Freedom Tower presentation that we did in New York. I think it might have been at the Harvard Club. I may have got that wrong. Where obviously we had SOM come present, and that was one thing we did do. We were very careful to do, which was, if you ever met Phil, it's hard to keep him down to less than 10 minutes on stage, because he's a good talker and it's very engaging. But we did 5 to 10 minutes of Phil speaking, and then most of the event was about an architect, someone he'd taken the risk, was an early adopter, doing the majority of the presentation. And we put zero constraints on how they presented. We didn't rehearse them. We did technically rehearse them, of course, but, we really didn't rehearse them. Quite often we didn't have a lot of sight of the information that's going to be presented. So there was a lot of trust. I think at the time, I think now it would give me kind of nightmares. Now I'd probably been corporatized a little bit more than I was then. I would want to see everything to make sure every detail was ready and nothing could go wrong. But, we had people, just opening up Revit and showing what they were doing live. And I think part of the reason we got a lot of traction at the top of the firms, and with, I would say, the influencers and advocates that come out of the educational side of the AIA and architects and colleges, was because we weren't really showing up and throwing up with marketing speak. It was, it was very professorial, if you like, the way that it was presented. And certainly it was quite a revolution in Autodesk at the time. Out of that, I got asked to help a lot of the other divisions, which are like manufacturing and others, to try and figure out their own thought leadership. And actually that was really tough. It was because trying to recreate that was really, really hard. And because it's hard to kind of to imagine that you can take something, with architects, you've got a professional community. And if I can say with a smile on my face, architects have a particular style and way that they like to consume information, which is very different from others, and I think it's an enjoyable way of engaging with your market. It also has its frustrations, because it's very much harder to do a traditional, I would say, value sell on that you would be able to do to a manufacturing company. And during my time at Autodesk, I was managing marketing teams that were addressing all of them. But it's hard to sell efficiency to an architect.
I just want to jump in here because I would love it if you're willing to kind of go a little bit deeper into that statement about how architects consume information. I mean, I think one of the things that I'll just throw out there is like total skepticism is typically like the first reaction that you get to just about anything. This is my experience with architects, especially in the technology space. It's like there's just and because like it is disruptive. There are people don't like finding new ways to do things necessarily. Not everybody's like just open to that, right? They're protective over the hard-earned lessons that they have and the experience that they have to get to the point they have. And now you're telling me there's a new way to do it or a new approach or whatever. And so I'm just curious, what are the kinds of things that you see how architects consume information? Because I think a lot of people who probably listen to the show are like, yeah, what is their secret code that we need to help crack?
If I could can it and sell it, I would have done that already. I think that I think I would take it just maybe take it back up to 50,000 feet from the actual things you do in marketing. It's certainly where I've seen successes and failures. There was a conversation I was having recently where I was trying to find an analogy to describe why the way architects look for and consume technology is very different from the way, say, a manufacturing company would. And a lot of it, I believe, has to do with the fact that we haven't really, in the build space or in the light of the build, if you like, had a downstream technology need or an artifact that requires technology that has forced the designer to change the way that they execute the design, which I believe has led to architects still being, for the most part, on a digital drawing board, even when they're working in 3D, compared to a manufacturer who through the mid-late 90s and obviously ever since at an ever more escalating pace, being forced to have to provide the design instructions for machines that create things. So you, originally the early CNC machines forced a massive change in the way that you created output from design software. And that just kept escalating and escalating into 3D printing and robotics and machine controls.
Yeah.
And we haven't seen that same sort of requirement put on the architect. And I lived through that when I was at Katura, because fundamentally we were trying to create that tool chain, if you like, where I always use this term design for constructability, or, and often people talk about DFMA, design for manufacturing. Design for manufacturing and design for constructability are tough to burden the architect with unless there is a direct pipeline to the machine or the robot or the device that forces the output to be created in a certain way. Manufacturing had to go through that. But I think we're just at the precipice of that being something that the architect is going to have to deal with. One could argue they should have been doing it for a while now.
But there is a divorce between construction and architecture, right? Like for the most part, and obviously not everywhere. Yeah. I mean, we had a guest on the show, Randall and I did. It was John Cerrone from Shop Architects, and they have a much tighter integration because they're so... They want to control the output, and they want to have that relationship with the fabricators, and they want to be able to minimize waste in the process, right? There's a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
But it also depends on the project type and the delivery type and the client and all of these things. Yes. And I think what's so interesting is, like, you're right, like the architects have to deliver ultimately like a PDF to a permitting agency and then to a contractor.
Exactly.
And who cares what tool you use to get to that point? Honestly, like sometimes still the right answer is AutoCAD or whatever, could be SketchUp. It could be any number of tools, right? But it's like it kind of doesn't matter because of the output and the outcomes that you're talking about. They're not having that kind of that pressure on them to get to that point.
Yeah, and it's funny going back all the way to the original presentations that Phil was showing. Is like he always had this slide which was describing the confrontational relationship between architects and contractors. Which many companies have tried to break down. Kieran Timberlake, with their books and the way that they try to do things, and AEC shop architects. It's not that people haven't made the effort to tear this down. But I still think for a lot of the industry is you've got an architect who sees contractors as gangsters with cranes, and contractors think architects create comics. I always remember my last job as a real designer is like, every time I used to go with my rolled up drawings onto the building site, my director of construction, he'd say, here he comes with his comics.
Wow.
It's just a general attitude towards, okay, show us what you think the building should look like, and then we'll figure it out. And I do think though that I'm a great believer in trying to follow inevitabilities. It was like it's like that very famous quote, skate to where the puck's going to be, not where the puck is. And I do think we're now starting to see a lot of clarity about where the puck's going to be, and it'll kind of lead on to maybe talking about, I think, how you have to change in the way that you look at marketing and also the way that you develop software and how you cooperate. It's becoming increasingly clear that there are some inevitable things coming towards us. That many companies have tried and failed, maybe tried to get there, that can start to dictate and guide us into what we should be doing, both on the software side of the industry and the challenges that the architectural firms and construction firms are going to need to go through.
Richard, before we jump into the new thing with Schema and all this has been coming together, one thing that I've observed, and I'll just use Revit as the example. I would say from early 2000s, probably up through the recession, 2008, 2009 timeframe, I would characterize what I was seeing in the industry was early adopters who were willing to experiment. So it's like, let's try this on this side project over here, or, do that. And really, we probably had to come out and step back. We probably had to come out of the recession. I always kind of claim that Revit really didn't tip until like 2012 kind of time frame, and, when you look back and say, okay, here you are, really 12, 15 years that the technology had been available. It had been in Autodesk hands then for, call it 8 years, right?
Yeah.
Just how much effort and energy it takes to get
a lot.
Yeah, movement. It's now we're 25 years in, and it's pervasive. Obviously, now it's probably you would say it's one of the at least in North America the architecture firms are largely using it. And now we're getting ready to maybe go into something new that might take another 25 years of, or will it? Let's bat that around.
Yeah, sure. I guess I'll qualify my comments by telling you my little history through that process. The last time I had any responsibility for Revit was I was managing marketing globally for all the AEC products in Autodesk. In a very uncomfortable dual reporting role where it's reporting to the CMO and the senior vice president of the AEC division on opposite coasts. I managed to do 200,000 air miles without leaving in 1 year, without leaving the USA, bouncing back and forwards. That's corporate life. I spent about two or 3 years between having the responsibility for Revit in North and South America, I guess the Americas, and then globally by being responsible for AutoCAD globally. And so I got to kind of sort of see many different kind of forms of product and the way, how adoption is or isn't easy. And also the way that, you wrestle internally in a company like Autodesk to kind of get top billings. It's like, funnily enough, AutoCAD was the one that created the most money within Autodesk, and it was the hardest to get attention inside Autodesk for that product. It had the smallest marketing budget, and you always were really being forced to play second fiddle a lot. But I think your analysis of the I would say the not I would say I've got to think about carefully what adoption actually means. I think the implementation of Revit, I agree, started sort of 2010, 2011 onwards. The adoption of Revit really kicked off in around about 2005. There was we went from really struggling to, and it was funny, it was like, up until, I would say the Freedom Tower was a big moment. Up until then, the general view of the industry was that Revit was only good for small buildings. And then almost overnight, it was like, well, Revit's only good for big buildings. So it was as a marketer, it was kind of an interesting challenge to kind of dance that line. The funny thing about it being only good for big buildings was that the Freedom Tower wasn't designed in Revit, it was designed in Graphisoft. Everything below ground was designed in Revit, and I think the top of the tower was designed in Revit. Everything in between was Graphisoft. So, and I've had quite a few amusing conversations with Victor Barcanel, who was the CEO of Graphisoft, and him grumbling about how we weren't clear on that being true. I was like, marketing, come on. So we always had fun with that. No. But I think that, I think it's in your statement, you're sort of saying, how does it take for a product to truly mature? And it takes, the more there's kind of two big factors I think that affect you is like, what does the completeness of that product look like? So when we decided that building information modeling was how we even described Revit, which is all the information for a building is in the model, that led us to have to make acquisitions in structure and MEP and HVAC to be able to support the story and develop those products. That led to a high degree of complexity, which I would say it slowed down adoption, but it complicated adoption because it was very hard to kind of create all that, all the integrations between, different professionals' needs in the same product space. So that's why platforms are very difficult to grow. I think as well that you kind of have to sort of, if you're creating a product that's for any building type in the world, in any country in the world, then that's also almost like make the challenge 10 times harder again. So I think Revit's has had a lot of criticism in recent years. We know about, there were certainly groups of leading architectural firms writing letters to Autodesk, being concerned about its future. I've always looked at it this way, and my co-founder Marty, who used the ex-product manager of Revit when it was Revit Technologies, and think about it the same way, is that I think I massively applaud what, particularly I would say, the product team within Autodesk managed to achieve with Revit, because it's very, very hard to satisfy the needs of such a broad market with a single product. And you could say that, yes, of course, AutoCAD did it, but AutoCAD was a drawing board. It wasn't discipline specific. It didn't have to know that the first step in Italy is half as high as the second step. There are things like that just, really hard to build its 3D functionality. So I think we have to applaud what Autodesk, has achieved with Revit. I think at the same time, you could say that anytime a product, becomes so dominant, it snowplows a lot of issues. I like using that term a lot. It's like you end up snowplowing issues to somewhere else in the tool chain. So by finally managing to get most of what you could get done for the architect within Revit, it meant that a lot of stuff that we'd hope that a design tool that was designing the constructability would do at the start would achieve got pushed out, which is like, there's some kind of nod in the grin phrase people use to say, well, most of the building is designed by the supply chain. It's not really designed by the architect. And I think that's it's cheeky, and there's some veracity in it when you get down to the detail of a building, is because it's almost impossible to, and there's also a need for it, as you said earlier, to be able to go out and get a set of permits. You don't need to, create the supply chain design for manufacturing information at the point where you're trying to get a building permit.
Makes sense. Well, let's kind of switch over to schema. Have you had Marty on?
You skipped Katera. That was.
Well, yeah. If you wanted, I don't really know that much about Katera. Knew it was going on, but wasn't deep into it, and it was obviously more complex than just software. That was a whole.
Yeah.
Maybe give us an overview of that.
Yeah, I have to tell a little bit of the Katera story because it kind of preloads, schema. So Katera, at the CEO, I was working directly with the CEO, a guy called Michael Marks, who was a remarkable character, very successful leader and investor. And he and his partners kind of came out of electronic manufacturing, iPhones and devices, and tried to bring as much of their supply chain think and know-how into basically revolutionizing construction. And the original intent of Katera was not to be a construction company or to be an architect. It was actually to be a very streamlined way of supplying building products into the industry without a cost plus way of building out and building an estimate, estimating the build. And see, when you come from an environment where that's just the way you work into construction, the initial idea is you think, well, we'll just do the same thing, replicate it, and of course it'll work. Of course, you find out that there's a lot of barriers to making that happen. So Katera blew up into a company that it had architects, engineers, factories, construction companies, and the reason it had to do that is to create enough momentum in the flywheel of the supply chain that it owned. It had to create demand, and decided to create demand by saying, okay, we'll go out and even buy land and demonstrate, that this is a better way of working. And there was a lot of successful things that happened through that.
So you basically also vertically integrate in order to become your own.
Exactly.
Consume.
So it meant like buying 13 companies, and I think definitely under 5 years. When I joined, we were in the hundreds, and when I left, when myself and Michael Marks left at the same time, I think there was somewhere in the region of 6,000 to 7,000 people, and that happened in 5 or 6 years. It was a massive exercise. I've never seen anything like it. It was remarkable, and I think there was a lot of things that were learned from that for the industry. I think you kind of look at these moments where people come together and try to create something, and even its failure, it starts a whole load of new things. And I think WeWork was a kind of sister company to us because we were both in the SoftBank kind of portfolio. And it was around that time I'd met Marty again, because he was at Dassault Systems, and he was trying to help Katera figure out how to go from design to factory in a more efficient way. Ultimately, Katera didn't choose Dassault, but we got everything. Both he and I were learning a lot through that process, and not too long after Katera weren't around anymore. And I think COVID really, when you're in such a cash flow intensive environment, is something like COVID crushes you, because a big company might be able to absorb it that's been around for 20 years, but when you're a company that's based on growth and cash flow, it was very hard. And that was one of the big reasons that Katerra is no more. We found ourselves in a bar in London and just started ending each other's sentences before we were talking about what we thought the industry needed. And I guess at the center of the concept was, we've been trying, back to my earlier comments, we've been trying so hard to build platforms our whole career. We tried to build a software platform with Katerra, by the way, called Apollo. We were going to build a whole new platform to do it. And we kind of said, it's like, look, what's wrong with, just being really good at 20%, 30%, 10%, 50%, whatever you decide. Okay, that's what part of the concept. And then the other part of the concept is that if in a building design, if I can basically use automation, AI, generative design capabilities to do 40, 50, 60% of the building, then if I do like just quick math and say, let's pick the 5 biggest segments with the most repeatable kind of design elements, that represents $6-7 trillion of construction a year globally, and we may never get to the, we might only be ever, building Toyotas and never building Rolls Royces, but that might be okay. And sure, if you look at that from the point of view of, how you could help company, designers and ultimately as you go down it, further down the tool chain into construction, help the light of the build, if you like, is, let's think about it a little bit differently than trying to create an all-encompassing design tool. Let's think about the pieces that we can automate that ultimately they might be tasks that don't differentiate you as a firm. They're just execution. But if I could do those efficiently, I could spend more time differentiating myself doing other things. And so it's kind of a big idea, but that's ultimately kind of part of the genesis of where Schema exists.
What year was that, Richard?
That's about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. Yeah.
And
it was in London. It was at Next Build in London.
Yeah,
so that was.
You keep mentioning, we all keep saying, I think Marty's name, Marty Rosemana. I was going to ask Kevin, have you had Marty on
I have.
TRXL
I'll
podcast?
put a link to that in the show notes for this. But yeah, I think I became aware of Schema probably at Confluence in Lexington when Marty was there. And then after that, we started talking and we did a podcast interview, and then I met both of you in Vegas at Autodesk University a couple of times ago, and that's where I really got to see Schema for the first time. And I guess my question, based on where you just ended that part of the history there with what you've been up to, is, there's this idea that there are specific tools for jobs in an architect's toolbox. And at the same time, there's a lot of internal kind of pressure. I mean, I've lived through this. Why don't you do everything in this tool, right? It's always Revit, right? But it's like, because it does everything kind of, or relatively well. And then it's like, well, we're wasting our time doing all this translation and this back and forth. But I think what's really changed in the last 5 years is just kind of file formats have started to go away in many respects, right? There's a lot of cloud infrastructure. There's a lot of APIs. There's a lot of machines being, apps being able to talk to each other without that whole getting back to the sawtooth thing, right? I mean, that applies to file import and export too, right? Every time you export, you lose something, and you import it, you got to add stuff back in, and then you lose it because you're doing all these different round trips for different use cases, right? You might be modeling, you might be rendering, doing visualization, you might be doing all kinds of things, energy modeling, things like that. So I'm just curious, from building a new tool, and just in the last couple of years, the appetite in architecture and engineering when it comes to having a lot of tools that do a thing but really well versus these platforms that try to do everything, this horizontal nature of what Revit ultimately became, right? Which was like any building anywhere.
Yeah.
Maybe not perfectly, and you got to do a lot of workarounds, and you got to fight. Like that's most people's they're fighting Revit most of the time, right? But then there's also kind of from the other side, there's also this kind of fatigue of, oh my gosh, another app that does another thing, and now I have to remember, I have to learn its UI, I've got to learn its all of these intricacies of how it works. Is it in the browser? Is it a desktop standalone app on, like there's so many variables now. So what's the appetite in the industry right now?
Well, I go back to that Wayne Gretzky quote again, so on the software side, we've got to try and skate to where the puck's going to be. And, that one challenge is the art of creating a software company. It's like, if you could be good at that, because, I think we were actually trying to edit this stuff out of a bunch of marketing material we had. It's like, can we use the word revolutionize, transform, rethink, it's like, I think,
Scares a lot of people.
Yeah.
Those words. Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about that as well as the burden I think software companies, which is what you're implying, put on users. I think the thing with platforms is I think come up with this term. Marty and I use it a lot. So I think the user bases or the customers are pretty fed up with being inside walled gardens. And they might be able to get out of the walled garden occasionally, but that tends to be pretty expensive. And it's not particularly well supported. So I think the challenge for a software creation now is to think about tool chains in a different way. And the reason I can think of it in a different way is through the availability of cloud APIs that have, if you like, non-file based exchanges of information. We've been a very fairly loud proponent of this, and it takes me back to what I learned from being involved with the manufacturing people like in Katera. Is like there's a term which I use, probably overuse it, co-opetition. And co-opetition is something that in the manufacturing space is normal. It's like you see it with car manufacturers where multiple manufacturers are using the same platform, or you see it with you see LG and Samsung using exactly the same, components, yet competing with each other for a market. And conceptually, I think we need to see much more competition between, particularly the new technologies coming to the market. I think the chances of a single software company emerging that would disrupt, an Autodesk, say, or an Autodesk in the United States, or a Graphisoft in Germany, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, where they have a particular, strength, is going to be extremely hard. It's certainly going to be extremely expensive. And that's not to say someone won't have the appetite to fund something of that ambition. But everything that I've seen and everything I hear is that people are looking for, people have got used to using apps, if you like, on phones, and they've got used to needing something, going and get an app that does it and having it work very, very well. And to your comment, Evan, and not have to learn very much to be able to use it. So you can almost think about, when is the last time you used an app on the iPhone where you found it difficult to kind of figure it out pretty quickly? And although you can argue that iOS is a platform in itself, I think we're going to see the same opportunity availability of tools for the designers, contractors, engineers start to come forward in this space. I think they have to. I think it has to happen, actually, both for the software firms to be successful, because it's incredibly difficult to build a software company, and also for the users to be able to, if you like, get the benefits of having things that do, 10% of what they need, but do it extremely well. And again, I go back into manufacturing. That type of specialization emerged very quickly because the the artifacts that were required from the designers to drive machines, robotics, and everything were very specific, and so it needed a lot of specialization specifically from those tools. And then it's just down to make sure the software companies know how to cooperate well enough to be able to. They've got to see enough opportunity in that cooperation to see it worth investing in. And I use the word competition because I think competition, is a stage that you go through until an aggregation happens where things come together. And I think that's where we're at right now. You could argue back in the 90s that Autodesk was cooperating with multiple professionals creating Lisp and EDA tools based on AutoCAD. And it's not quite competing. Certainly, there was a period where, there were 10, 20 different tools. I mean, so speaking about Archridge and others, and there was all these solutions that you could choose where Autodesk might have an alternative. But still, they'd have to cooperate with those companies. And eventually you see these things come together.
I hadn't really thought about, I think I agree with you that there's got to be these, I'll call it micro exchanges of data across these apps. I hadn't really thought about it until you were saying that, but really geometry is probably, I'll put a stake in the ground if we can debate this. Geometry is easy because the language of the geometry is well defined. It's vectors and math and surfaces, and it's the rest of this data. I call it the loose content problem is the way I always describe it. It's like, and that's stuff that's either in these files, but it's really this data. There is no common EDI in the industry. There's no standards to the way that this, even down to the way you describe. We did some work, a little side project with somebody from the Army Corps a handful of years ago for one of the build conferences where we were analyzing, because they get a lot of data sent to them in the form of Revit files. So we ran these experiments about how many different ways were fire ratings, described, indoors across these projects. And we gathered all this data and we graphed it out. And it was just like, it's all over the place. There is no standard. But I keep thinking, and we're going to be talking about it at our one-day Confluence event in San Francisco next week.
Yep.
What I'm seeing with the work that we're doing here is that the AI may be the answer to this, in that you can take largely unstructured data and start to put some structure to it. Whereas that before required lots of manual translation or humans in that loop. But I think we're maybe on the path to that becoming not as big a problem than it has been in the past, because that seems to be, if you talk about needing APIs to different kinds of data, you got to know what you're asking for. That language, has to be.
Yeah, but here's the good news. Machines are really good at figuring that out. It's like, I think I could say which company is specifically I'm digging at here, but I'll spare their blushes. Is like, when I hear a software company go out and start telling, architects and engineers in particular, that the first thing they should be doing right now is figuring out a data strategy. It makes me really frustrated, because I don't think we as software providers should be burdening the professions with another thing that they have to manage. Now, that's not to say a firm shouldn't be good at managing its data, but I think the burden is on the software companies to make that the easiest thing possible to do, because there's no doubt that you can create correlations between disparate data standards very easily. I mean, it's like we do it on lookup tables in Excel all the time, which is what still leaves most of the construction industry works on Excel, which is the big dirty secret. It's just, that's still the predominant software people
Probably the
rely
number
on.
one BIM platform in the world.
Yeah.
I was going to say the biggest, the most popular database in the world for sure.
Yeah. So what happens when you have, two disparate, ways of data coming together? You do lookup tables between those two data standards and you come up with an answer. Well, guess what? That's what machines do really, really well.
Yeah.
And so if I can talk a little bit about what I think is awesome about AI, but also what I think is unfortunate right now. I think I think that I think everyone's got very fascinated by the opportunity to be, or the thought that they could be another firm that's into parametricism. No, they could be another Zaha Hadid. Now with the power of AI, it unlocks me to be able to describe a structure or describe a building that, breaks the norm, because, the algorithm can show me something that should be able to be constructed. Because it can, it'll figure out, the math of how to make something look pretty kind of wild and impressive, without having to resort to, what Frank Gehry used to do, which is like scan the paper he crumpled up kind of idea. But I think that's, it's just like when 3D first came in, the first benefit of 3D was to visualize something. It wasn't to create construction information. It's like a drug. I think the way that we're looking at AI right now is like, we're looking at the quick kind of fix, quick kind of highly gratifying kind of results you can get. So look, I can see a building in any type of brick type or any type of finish, and that's all very interesting. I think I don't discount that being a great tool, but the really uncool kind of boring stuff, which is like, I say this is the one biggest challenge I think that unlocks an incredible amount of money for either for software suppliers and for the industry, is, can we please just have technology that helps me build a model that I can trust? And this goes back to the snowplow, is that even with some of the new tools we see coming into the market, and it's very focused on collaboration, which, not to say collaboration isn't important, but a lot of that collaboration is about finding the issues that were designed into the model. So until we can start doing clash avoidance instead of clash detection, and then I think that's a real challenge to have a trusted model. So being able to automate as much as possible as the model creation, particularly around building cores. I think building cores is such an obvious place to start, where there are a lot of rules. Physics actually counts. Anything that physics matters. And why we don't design with physics from the get-go is still, if I'm playing a video game, I'm playing with physics. Things weigh things. Even I can even get that sense about if I'm driving a car, I feel the physics of that experience. So, why can't we have physics in design tools? You come back to that if you like. I think that I do think, I'll just say it. I do think we're still underserving the industry a little bit on the software side. However, I would go back to that earlier thing I said. The architects aren't asking us to change the solution to satisfy a downstream need that's different. They want us to help them find a faster way of getting to permits, which is why you're suddenly seeing this whole new kind of bunch of automated drawing tools hitting the market. What they're not doing is saying, it's like, hey, look, I know the output from my trusted model is going to go to the supply chain and onto the construction site, and they're going to rely on that to instruct a robotic vehicle to do something. So you better make sure the software model is something that can be trusted. That's the inevitability I see. But we're not. Yeah, we're not there, obviously. I jumped around a bit there. Sorry.
No, I was trying to think, just what the next question on that front would be, because it's the, I mean, I've been putting together a presentation that I'm going to use next week, but I keep calling the work that we've been doing on the AI, it is the unsexy part of it. It's not the image and all that side of it, but there's a lot of need to get this data structured, because it's It's all over
Yeah,
the place.
I always like to use this example, and this isn't necessarily an AI example, but it's implied by this. Whenever people ask me, how does machine learning and AI work, I said, well, rather than go into that, it's just a simple example of what a machine can do that a human would really struggle with. So if you can imagine a football field full of elephants and giraffes, and you're asked to count how many giraffes and how many elephants. For one human being, that's a really big ask. For a start, the things keep moving. So you go 1, 2, 3. Damn, that one just moved. 1, 2, 3, 4. Can you all just, so you end up having to create corrals, and you have to sort of start herding them from one side to the other. And then when you've done that, you've got all the elephants on one side and all the giraffes on the other side. Then you count them, but then they keep moving. So, so you can it's a complex problem for a human. For a machine that's trained on the difference between elephants and giraffes, you just go, where are they? There. 532 giraffes, 623 elephants. That's a really simple example of how something that seems ultimately mundane can have a massive impact if you think about how to use a machine to solve it. And I don't think we do enough of that. I've been to a bunch of AI conferences, AI and AEC conferences recently, and I will be at Confluence next week. So
Okay, good.
I'm sure yours is not going to be like this. So
I'll take notes.
but I think I think there's, I won't say it's a lack of ambition. I would say it's a lack of clarity on understanding how these technologies can ultimately solve relatively mundane but highly complex in their difficult to execute things in our space. So in Schema, what we've decided to pick is it's really hard to get information from a previous project compiled in such a way that we can re-execute it in the next project with total assurance that the machine will take care of then how I've taken that intelligence and fit it together in the next project, and we're just going to keep edging that up, using the LOD kind of standards as, we're going up to LOD 350 right now, but we're going to keep edging up into 400 and beyond. And that's ultimately when we'll have a fully trusted model. And then things like digital twins could actually maybe happen. And, true sequencing of construction might actually be able to be figured out. There's all these things that unlocks when you can get to that point. And so I think that rather than thinking about standards, I think we need to start thinking a little bit more about tasks and execution of the things that the machines could do really well, that we're still putting our interns and our first year, postgrads onto, because that's the mundane donkey work. That's the rite of passage that you have to do for the first 5-10 years of your architectural career before we actually start designing.
So what
something.
happens when those tasks don't exist for those people? I mean, and not to say that the most mundane tasks need to be the things that they're trained on, but then architects have to adapt in how they bring people up in the profession, and I don't even know if they're ready for that because they can barely do the thing that exists right now.
Yeah, I was in an AI event about a year and a half ago, and I hadn't been to one. It was one of the chapters, city chapters. And it's funny, the number one thing that, this mostly crowd of, I would say, 25 to 35-year-olds that we were there were asking the panels and asking everyone was how do I get trained? How do I find a way to get better trained on Revit? And it's fundamentally because the schools don't really give you much training, if any, on Revit. They see it a little as constraining, and the architectural firms are, it's a highly expensive exercise to train architects on Revit. And if they become any good, they become a highly marketable commodity that gets hired away too easily. So it's funny. Patrick Schumacher did an article recently at the Zine, where he was basically lambasting architectural schools and the profession, saying that you could almost do away with architectural schools now, because why not just have them come in and learn how to use Revit to do buildings that aren't that interesting, was his argument, which I thought was a little depressing. But there was some truths in what he was saying. I think that what we're not doing is unlocking. I don't think we're unlocking the potential for architecture to evolve through technology right now in a way that we might be able to. And Evan, I think you kind of maybe you implied in your question was, well, okay, Richard, well, that's very well. What does that mean? There's less architects if the technologies are doing the automated work. Possibly. I think there is a pretty long period of the same number of people working more on quality of design and quality of design artifact that gets created before you see a reduction in number of people in architectural. So I think people, I think there's this kind of race to get to the production phase. Or it's almost like you try to stay out of production as long as you possibly can, but you're trying to get there quickly because you know how long production takes you. And going back to, well, I go back to the Clay curve, is built into this is like, sorry, Revit, but know how you work. Is like there's so many locked-in dependencies on creating a building information model in something like Revit that makes change really hard. So you find yourself, if you could compress the schedule of production of the model, of a trusted model, to give you more time in the exploration of design and design quality, then I think that would be a very good place to be, because what you can also pull into there is integration and consultation with engineers and structural engineers. Right now it's like, you could argue they get involved far too late in the process to impact the production model that comes out of the architects. I was speaking to BDP this last week, and they're trying like mad to try and get the engineers and structural engineers, and this has been a story for the last 20 years, to try and get as many of the professions working earlier, not waiting for the design permit model, as it were, to be finished.
Yeah.
And I guess that's my ambition with Schema, personally, is to try and create space during the schematic design phase that would dramatically increase the quality of what comes out.
This is a perfect segue into Schema, but I do want to say one thing right here, because I've lived that part of it that you were just describing. And it's not because, it goes both ways. Architects don't want to design with all those constraints in place a lot of times. And engineers don't want the design to keep changing. And that's what happens in design. Like, design changes. And I can't tell you how many engineers I've had on projects where they say, we will have our first pass when you are done with DD, when you are done with design development, because then it's pretty locked in. And so, like, again, it kind of comes back to like everything has to change everywhere, right? It's like the contracts have to change, the rules of engagement have to change, the types of output from drawings to models has to change for lots of reasons, right? To manufacturing, but also agencies have to be involved, also contracts have to be involved, also insurance has to be involved. Like, all of these things have to change. And I think that's what makes it so difficult, right? It's like, let's be honest, this is a tough problem, totally a huge, huge problem.
No, I would agree. But I think that's changing. So, one of our investors actually is a group called the AEC Angels, which has got like Sharp Architects and Don Tomasetti, STO, DPR there as well, amongst others. They're like an investment club, and they look for technologies. Very interesting group of people. And one of the guys who leads it is the chairman of Don Tomasetti, Tom Scarangello, and things are changing. And exactly what you described is a conversation that we've kind of had. And I think, he always sort of says, he's gone from, he said, like, he's gone from 20, 26, 30 years ago at a dinner party being somewhat embarrassed to say he was a structural engineer because it seemed so dull and boring, to being actually really excited to talk about being a structural engineer. And I
the evolution of an engineer.
My favorite thing. Yeah. I love it. And it's like, because now it's a really exciting, dynamic place to be. Core studios there are trying to develop solutions that are flexible enough to at least get the wireframes part of the process figured out during schematic design. So I think this goes back to okay, maybe not 100% structured design can be figured out that early, but if we know basically, at least the wireframes, let's start with just, does the wireframe work, or whether it's precast or cold roll steel, whatever. And, have we got the spans, at least in the place where when it gets through DD, then it goes, it doesn't look like an alien landed in the structural engineer's office. Like, what were they thinking? There has been some degree of pre-thinking. I think you look at tools like Augmentor, I think are at the bastion of, being able to auto route, MEP through a building, and such. So in Schema, where we can sort of, within our design catalogs, when we put our unitized design using units to set out a building, we can go down to the light switch entry exit points for HVAC. All the equipment within a unit can be there. So then a tool like Augmentor we can say where, where the important kind of entry exit points are for the whole system within the building, and where the control rooms are. And then it can have a go at processing it. Yeah, that still takes a day for a computer to figure it out, but that's a lot quicker than we've had before. And we can get that schematic base now.
We had, we'll put, Evan will have to put in the show notes, but we had Rob Otani that runs the Core Studio. And Thornton was on the show, and he participated in our 3-day Confluence event this past fall. And, I do think that, maybe, Evan, that's what is going to get to those early stages when things are moving quickly. They're also working on technology that lets them do things very quickly in those early stages, at least give you that early feedback and around the structural design.
Yeah.
So, maybe as those kinds of technologies progress on that side, it can help to ease that tension, right?
And I think you'd have to go back to as well as like, look, I would love to, you could say in the manufacturing side, you always have to look at 100% solution, which is why companies like ANSYS exist. So you got to figure out all that stuff very, very early, whether the thing you just designed is actually going to stand up to the forces that are going to be put on it. I think for a while, we have the opportunity to automate and investigate the 20% of the building design that causes 80% of the issues downstream in terms of change and change management. It's like, so because the 80-20 rule is kind of a little bit obvious to say it, but that's very different going all the way back to what we were trying to do with Revit when we first did Revit. It's like, no, we're going to create something that can design any building and keep all the drawings coordinated. That's so it comes down to defining the problem you're trying to solve. And that goes back to, how we use AI. As I was saying earlier, it's like, you got to have a very clear idea of the problems you're trying to solve and the outcomes that could have the most benefit to you. And like I said, I think the industry is getting better at defining it. An AEC specification that came out of the UK was a great first pass. I think, the activist kind of things where the Lettuce group, I think they were called, started to tell Autodesk exactly what they need. I think that these are great things where the industry, is trying to pick the ball up. I think there are too many in the architects and engineering side that are trying to become software companies. That's a whole different conversation we can have. But I think the reason that's happening is because I think the software side, us on the software side, would be doing better. I think we could.
Well, I think, I think what at least I was hearing you say is that it's going to be the interoperability and exchange of information between these different pieces, and the less friction there is with that to happen probably means that, maybe the future there isn't going to be a replacement for Revit. It's going to be lots of tools that know how to talk to each other that ultimately, there isn't going to be one big thing that maybe evolves and is
No. And maybe Revit sticks around for quite a long time. Sure. Look at AutoCAD.
It may just become it's primarily a documentation tool, right? So it might live there and have its strength there, and then pieces that that it's.
I think for a period you're definitely going to see solutions, including ours, and efforts to automate drawings and I would say engineering improve the production capabilities of an architect to create effectively permits. So I think you should look at right now we look at the permit kind of workflow as being a component of design for manufacturing workflow. I think you're going to see a bifurcation where you're going to start to be able to preload your supply chain with one workflow whilst you're getting your permits on the other. And I know that sounds like, well, shouldn't they be the same? I'm talking about the parallel processing. I think you're going to have enough connectivity between those two workflows such that, you won't lose connection. So I can tell you, if I could send at least a wireframe to my cold roll steel supplier for a building in a certain place, knowing that piece, and 70-80% of the quantities are pretty much nailed in, then your supply chain can start to become more efficient. Just that's a very simplistic example, and maybe too simplistic, but it kind of implies the opportunities that you have. If I can use if on a schematic building model preview that we created, Schema can have auto routing of MEP and wiring, and I can send pretty much effectively a first pass at wiring to my supply chain. Then if I'm managing, that part of it, and I trust the information I'm getting, then you're starting to see the water, all waters rise together on being able to be more efficient on how you manage your supply chain. Rather than it being this back to the sawtooth, this abrupt kind of what happens now. Okay.
Yeah, I was having actually last week when we were out at the Revit anniversary party, I can't remember exactly who I was talking to, but we were both kind of saying that the big finance probably what moves this along, right? You can talk about technology. We're all developing technologies and trying to improve that, but really it's going to be the money, the finance side of it, the contract side of it, and that pressure as those things adjust and change will drive a lot of this change, not necessarily software technology.
Yeah, yes. If we could look back at the history of IPD, which kind of started to get momentum at the same time as BIM did, actually, is like, I think everyone thought IPD might become the thing that would totally tip over and revolutionize the way we worked. Ultimately, the way money moves through the life of the build is highly complex, and I think money follows. I think you could create gravity for money by providing clear trust and efficiency in the way that you execute the work. And I don't think, we're clearly not there, but there's not enough improvement in the tool chain and the efficiency that can drive to provide gravity for money to move from the way it's currently spent into a new way it's being spent.
Yeah, I was just thinking though, Richard, the way you were describing, which I agree, is that this information gets to some point and it's all sequential. Now I'll do what I'm supposed to do. Only I think it is a trust problem, the trust in that information, and at some point,
and there's a lot of contract risk there. There's a lot of contract risk there as well. So, but I don't think contracts change until trust happens. And IPD was basically, we're going to trust each other, but the artifacts didn't change, which fundamentally undermined the idea of the trust, because at a certain point, the architects know, I don't need to provide that information to get my part of the process done.
I was just going to add in that one of you said the way money flows through a project is complex, and there's actually a book, I can't remember the name of it, but it was by a guy out of Canada, very, very involved in the building industry, but it was something like the number was 50 cents of every dollar is wasted in these kinds of projects. And it's insane, right? And so, like, back to Randall's point about money driving this, it's like, okay, you can see all the little ways, but you can also see some really big ways in which there's some major issues in the way that the building industry continues to operate with these broken systems, right? And
Yeah.
you
Well, we don't have. We don't have.
you get
Yeah.
to these owners, you get to these developers who are actually like, I mean, incredibly sophisticated, driving these things forward. There's going to be a huge amount of pressure to come up with a new way of doing things.
We
Yeah.
hope so. I mean, it's interesting, and it's the only. I will mention some political things, hopefully without getting political. Is so there was a very similar kind of conceptually a very similar exercise to Doge happened in the UK in the late 90s and around 2000 that was started with what's called the Latham Report. And basically the UK government, it was back when I lived in England, basically the UK government decided that they were spending all this money, government money, on buildings, but it was so highly inefficient, and the efficiency was large enough that they should do a study. And so this guy, Latham, I think Lord Latham at the end, did a report, and he identified 30% of construction as the avoidable cost of error, and 70% of that is informational error. Just wrong information, wrong time, or wrong information given. So wrong version of drawings or whatever it might be. Then that was followed, I think it was like 3 to 5 years later by John Egan did. He was the ex-chairman of Jaguar Cars. Was asked to do a follow-up report to look at the progress since the first report. And he came up with almost exactly the same figures. And then he was invited again to do it. Like I won't get the year right, but you can look it up. And I think it might have been 2012. I think his first report was might have been 2002. It might have been earlier. But he did one in, about 10 to 12, 13 years ago to track what the progress has been. And there were some improvements. Most of it was in the availability of information because of digital kind of sources. But what was happening on the building sites in terms of errors and waste hadn't moved that much. Then, I find myself, within the last 12 months, speaking to someone very senior, one of the largest construction companies in the United States, who, again, I won't mention to spare blushes, said is that we have this thing where we say for every 3 buildings we build, we put 1 in the ground. That's kind of the statistics they come up with when they look back and track back what happened during construction over many, many buildings a year that they construct. So what does that mean? What it means is that we might be trying to address the wrong things to solve these issues. And I think it's almost like, you could look at many things. You could look at sustainability and trying to do low carbon. It's like, if you wanted to dramatically reduce carbon, you should look at the biggest kind of dominoes you can knock over. And concrete's obviously, maybe steel, but concrete's probably the biggest. And, so concrete probably accounts for 20 to 25% of embodied carbon that goes into a building, and probably in production carbon as well in creating concrete. Probably the equation explodes somewhat. And then you look at concrete suppliers around the world, and there aren't that many companies, so you'd think that would be something that you'd be able to address and manage, but we don't focus on that. We focus on other things. We focus more on how we measure the outputs, rather than, is there something that should be legislated in the supply chain or technology should point out to solve it, so I think we see this goes all the way back to, I think, is how we should sort of be thinking about the things we should target, automation, AI, next generation technologies at, is that I don't think it's about how do I become a better, more innovative and expansive thinking designer. I think the profession of the architect, as we used to say in the UK, we called it the clerk of work. So goes all the way back to the architect was also the site manager when, we used to build things, hundreds of years ago. I think that side of it, is something that we should have more focus on, and or there should be incentives for that to happen. And the incentives are going to get driven by what you were talking about, Evan, And it's like, is that the owners are going to sort of say, well, like, no, we really want that. We see and we clearly want that.
Yeah, there was Evan, I'll maybe put my hands on it and maybe we can put a link to it, but there was a interview with Mark Andreessen 2 or 3 years ago. And in there, he was saying, he called it the fast change parts of the economy and slow change parts of the economy. And construction was one of the slow change, along with healthcare and some of the others. But, besides regulation being a part of it that they have in common that slows things down. But I think the number he threw out was like, fully loaded construction costs have doubled, adjusted for inflation in the last, 30 years. And it eats, his quote was like, it's eating, it's what's driving the inflation. The couple of different sectors largely are eating all of the money where you get all this efficiency in other parts of the market. These things just keep getting more expensive and more expensive and more expensive, not better, not less expensive. Right. And, but, as we've talked through this, it is a little bit different than traditional manufacturing, but it doesn't mean that there's not an answer. There's an answer in here somewhere. There is going to be a revolution.
Yeah.
Not think to just put a kind of into that part of the conversation. It's like, I don't think it's going to be us making what people are doing today more efficient. It's going to have to be some break in the contractual way, financial way, something that's going to make everybody go, okay, we've got to realign. And to your point, Richard, it's that doing these things in parallel with a backplane of data that everybody is trusting in this process that's going to, maybe stand a chance of squeezing the efficiency back out.
Yeah, it's like an old mentor of mine said, people are much slower to leave a burning platform than to go to a green field. And you say, well, that just doesn't seem to make sense. But it's this, you could debate whether that's true or not.
Well, it's risk. It's a form of risk. The devil you know or the devil you don't know, and
But it describes why you have early adopters and the late majority.
Laggards,
So if you know chasm theory, I don't know if you guys who studied that. So Philip Lay, who worked for Chasm Group, was a good friend of mine, and he's saying it's like it's strange that book's been around for so long, and yet it still seems remarkably fresh when you kind of look at it.
Sure.
So talking about how do you enter a market, anyone, if you're watching this, is like that was a great book to read. Honestly, it's in my career, I go back to those principles over and over and over again to kind of check yourself. It's like you can't navigate your go-to-market plan unless you know where you are. And that takes horrible honesty that most teams are really bad at being honest about.
Yes.
It's like you sit there with your team. I mean, honestly, we had one this morning, where we had to really kind of say, okay, are we sure we're where we think we are? It's like, I know we'd like to think we're at that stage, but are we at that stage? Maybe we're at this stage. And because it's very important that you know that if you're going to plot what you do next, and I think, I think that's an important way of thinking about it.
Yeah, I teach an entrepreneurship class. Been doing that for the last 10 or so years, and at the university, and I reference the Crossing the Chasm book. It's one of my.
Yeah.
Hey, you have to. First of all, we're going to talk a lot about this very, very early stage, but it's a weird stage because you got a bunch of weird.
And it feels great.
Action.
It feels
it's
great.
Fun. If you like that, it's fun, right? But
yes, it's never been easier to prototype a piece of software, and it's really easy to engage the early adopters. They're now employed. It's like it's a statistic which I kind of accidentally captured because I did it. It wasn't long after I left Autodesk. I was in a company where it was important information. To say how many job titles were there in architects, engineers, contractors that had either digital or transformation, or some version of that in their job title, and I mean globally, I found less than 100. I did the same exercise about 2.5, 3 years ago, and there were thousands of people employed with the director of digital transformation, the director of, change man. And it's like all these new job titles have kind of emerged, which are all about like, there's someone in the company who's responsible for evolving the company to the next stage. That's great, but for an early stage software company, it can be deadly because these guys are employed to spend time with you.
Yes.
And it feels great.
I call them happy meetings. I've lived my life in happy meetings. It's like, just because everybody shook their head and you left here doesn't mean that there's that something's going to happen after you leave that meeting, right?
Yeah, and and it spills down. There's a fact that you can, it's like you see brand new tools coming to the market, and the web page immediately has, many quotes from people from very, very reputable firms, saying how awesome your product is and how it's going to revolutionize the market. Investors love it. So you can sort of see money following not things that aren't necessarily completely fleshed out ideas. No, I'm not saying you should try and solve it. I'm just saying that's kind of what's going on.
Right. No, well, this has been a great conversation. I'm just thinking it's like we probably should do another one of these. This you're going to be at the end of our second season of this podcast, this Confluence series, but maybe sometime in the next season we can get you and Marty together back on here, and we can maybe do something a little more directly around the software and what's going on that front.
Yeah, I'll probably be in trouble for not marketing my software.
That's Randall's fault. That's Randall's fault. He can't. It's not your fault, Richard. He's bad hosting there, Randall. Jeez.
No, it gives us an opportunity
Absolutely.
to come back. And but I think as I said, given your long important history in the industry, at critical times when things are changing, I think it's important, especially if we've got other people that are trying to develop software platforms and stuff. Just what are the challenges with how to? Anytime you're trying to educate a market is always the bloodiest and hardest, right? And it's just a minefield.
Yeah,
and
it is. But I would say it's like I think. I'm English, so I could be sitting on a beach with a cocktail and sound miserable. It's just can happen. It's just part of big English. It's like, I'm really not as upset as I look after talking. But I think this is God, I hope I'm not saying this in 5 years' time. Is like, because I think I might have been saying it 5 years ago, but I do think this is an incredibly fantastic period to be involved in what the transformations are going on in this industry. And I would say that there's a lot of great minds thinking about this stuff and trying to work on it. I do think things like Confluence. I think Next Build's another great group, and another great conference, Mondays, conference and his magazine. I do think that that there is an appetite that we have now for change that I think is great. I think we're seeing a very similar kind of revolution on the technology side that we saw marketing technology go through. I think in 2005 there were something like 300 identifiable marketing software solutions in the market. By 2015, there was like 7,000. It was like an unbelievable explosion of growth in companies. And I think we've seen, or are seeing, the same thing happen here. I think the fact that we're seeing some of the larger companies throw off some both long-standing people who've had success as well as others means that there are going to be people coming into the market that are looking to do new things, hopefully with a bit of support. There's obviously the group with one of my old bosses just came out with his new software company out of the Autodesk kind of world. I'm not going to say name the company because my marketing person will kill me if I do. But no, I think it's great. I think it's great. I want to see companies like that and others be successful. I think we need to see a clear demonstration that solving design challenges with software over and above creating another faster, cheaper replacement for Revit is like, I think that's great. And we need people to be successful. We need to demonstrate to investors that this is an area that is worthy of being supported. And we've had on the construction side a few companies, fulfill that. I think Procore, it's the longest overnight success that you've ever seen, but the fact that they got there was great. And we need to see that now happen certainly on the design side, and it's tough, architects, engineers in particular don't have, where the per hour cost is the thing that dictates most of the cost. Is hard for technology to get a big share of the pie, unless it can start to take money from the HR, if you like, costs. Which it goes back to what I was saying, is like, you've got to look at those tasks that now are highly employee resource intensive, and figure out, is there other ways that you can use software to help solve some of those challenges. So this is a great time to be involved in this. There's going to be failures, there's going to be successes. Hope ours is one of the successes, but it's no guarantee. But I think it's, if you haven't heard, we talk a lot about our software here. I think hopefully you've heard a lot about our attitude and what we're trying to do.
Well, I was just
in
getting
the way
ready.
we approach the industry. And hopefully that gives them trust. Yes.
Software is a reflection of the people that are building it. And I think it's, it's important to understand the philosophy behind what people are doing, because it gives people a sense of a piece of software that you're going to use today is going to be different, hopefully 6 months, 12 months from now. And it's because of the people behind it and the way that they're thinking and the direction that they're going. You're never finished. So it's, I think it's important. And this has been a fun conversation to get to hear a little bit about the way you've thought about it. And wasn't kidding. We'll have you and Marty come back on, and maybe we can dig in. It's been a little bit hard to get people to do it, but it's fun to bring up the software and like dig into maybe a feature and just talk through how it came about and what discussion was, why you made certain choices, right, that you made, because always trade-offs. And so that's a little bit of the kind of behind the scenes of how the sausage is made, in this industry.
Well, it'll be good timing. It'll be good timing for us. We just got a whole new releases coming out soon. We did our SketchUp integration, which was a big unlock for us. We now Rhino, the ability to work with Rhino now is going to be a huge unlock for us again. And our ability to, at the core of what we're trying to do is we're trying to make the ability to do, automate the parts of the creation and design without scripting available to anybody. It's like, so I think that for us is a big piece of what we're going to do next. And also the ability to consume a graph, a very complex description of the relationships between rooms or units within the building. That's the first part of being able to do that in a highly intelligent way. So I'm sure you really enjoyed the conversation, hearing what Marty's cooked up with the developers. We'd be happy to come and show it to you.
We'll put some links to your all's website and stuff in the show notes. But and then I look forward to seeing you again. Maybe next week we'll get to spend a few minutes talking with each other. And I think this podcast will be out after that event, so it's kind of too if somebody didn't know about it to get registered. But we will be in San Francisco next week with one day.
So you could edit this piece in, and I can say, Randall, that was a great comment. That was a great presentation you made at the conference yesterday.
Good foreshadowing.
Nice.
Yeah. Well, good. We'll wrap this up for today, and we'll look forward to the next conversation. Thanks, Richard.
Right. And Evan, next time we'll get the guitars out.
I'm looking forward to it. Just final thing about that I thought was so interesting, because, I think about like the guitar that you were holding, and I think about some of these iconic shapes back here on my wall. Like, people know these brands because of marketing, right? And you apply that to AEC industry. It's like, who spends the most money marketing? Those are the things that everybody knows. And that's really what a company in the startup space is fighting. against is just how do you get the exposure? How do you get the eyeballs? How do you build the trust? How do you build the relationships? And I think like the things that you really got to in this deep cut of an interview today, right? Really kind of what's going on in the industry that you're seeing and that you've seen over decades now, right? Is just that's where those where the real issues are. And to me, that's what's so valuable about these kinds of conversations. It's like, yeah, there's like those companies, they don't even they would never pay a podcast to talk about them because they get their marketing for free, right?
Yeah.
That's how it works, and because everybody's talking about them, because everybody's using them. But you know, to your point about there being a lot of startups, but they're all competing against that, and that's a tough road, a tough thing to do. But also, I mean, I just really appreciate the level to which you're really able to share what your experience is and what you're seeing here, because this is the kind of place where Randall and I are trying to facilitate that to happen. And I think there's a lot of value in people overhearing those kinds of conversations in our industry.
Yeah, and I'd always be happy to come back and talk a little bit more about some of the specifics of, you know, marketing and how do you get that authentic ownership of a corner of the road. And that word authentic is a really important word. You know, reputation and authenticity is they're the hardest things. They're the hardest things to claim or to develop, and the easiest things to lose. You know, and you know the fundamentally it's sadly, but often true that the product isn't the most important piece of it. You know, it's often that it's about, you know, how you present yourself to the market and how specific you are about the corner of the room and the problems you're trying to solve. You know, and I think that's something always happy to speak to you about more. Yeah, it's a fun industry to work in, hugely frustrating, hugely rewarding, and you guys I know have been trying to solve this for a long time. Me too, and then hopefully good days ahead.
Thanks, Richard. Until next time, then.
Thanks, Richard.
All right, thanks, guys.